Okay, so just a bit of context before the context. I'm a first year PhD student at UCL, and I work with two other people, Maurizio and Paul, on this project. And yeah, so to begin, I'll start with the context and aims. This project is part of the CDRC, the Consumer Data Research Center, which is affiliated to several universities, and it aims to trace change in mainly the UK geodemographics and urban structures. And it does so by different consumer data sets, one of them being telephone directories. And this data that we procured was possible also because of an industry partnership with British Telecoms, who gave us scans of almost every page of every directory from 1880 until the late 1980s. Yeah. So before going to the specifics, just wanted to cover some of the broad questions that we initially thought about before beginning the research. And one of the things that we thought could be answered using telephone directories is the same question as can be answered by, for instance, the census data. How can we know about who lived and where they lived in the past of Britain? And the telephone directory has some advantages over most prominently the census data in enabling us to do a deep dive into the history through a quantitative way. And of course, there's also this contradiction in that a lot more data is available recently, but a lot less of it is being done, a lot less digitization is being done for all the data. And that's why we're trying to increase the digitization, which allows us to find something from the past. Yeah. Another broad question that we sought to answer was to retrace the growth of the telephone service provision in the UK. A lot, as I've come to find out, a lot is written about it in several American cities, not so much in London or in the UK, but in the UK it began with London, and that's why you see this is one of the first maps of telephone exchange geographies in the UK. Yeah, so specific project aims, the first part is just to make a structured data set from all the scans that we have gathered from BT, and extracting three main kinds of data. So the names and the addresses of the subscribers, and then we can also infer usually based on the name entry, whether it's a commercial or a residential subscriber. And then in the future, when we have the first objective more or less sorted, we can revisit some historical questions that many other academics probably have tried to answer, but they couldn't have approached from this perspective just because data and the technology to analyze the data wasn't available then. Yeah, and I'll be covering these in a bit. So the next section I'm going to be speaking about are the methods and some of the key assumptions that we had to make in making the processing pipeline. So this has been most of the work that has been done so far, where we try and convert what initially are just a massive collection of scans, and then in the first step through image pre-processing and optical character recognition, or OCR, we convert them to a table that can be analyzed and analyzed in tandem, importantly, with other data sets. So thereafter, we geocode the data, where instead of having address strings, we convert them into latitude and longitude information, which we then can use to map and do some spatial analysis. Yeah, so regarding, some basic obstacles that we face when we were trying to do the initial part of OCR, I would cover just two of these here, where a lot of the problems that usually occur with OCR optimization is regarding the font styles and the publication methods that were used for historical documents. Specifically, if you see point number 4, that's dilation and erosion, where a lot of the inks in historical documents tended to either smudge or they tended to be too thin. And so dilation or erosion is a process of correcting that. But we found that it didn't really matter for our case, because luckily for us, 1880 makes the documents relatively modern, so it wasn't susceptible. Yeah, the other main issue that we had to overcome was about page segmentation, and that's basically that from the scans, when you capture the written data, the textual data, you want them ideally to come out in a table form. But it's not easy to do that by default, because in telephone directories, what they're missing are lines that demarcate entries and demarcate the different kinds of data. So instead, we use regular expressions, and that's when you try and separate a string based on the emergent patterns that are in each string. So for instance, in the first part, we find the first number that's not succeeded by another number. And then we can use the dots usually in most lines to separate the subscriber name. And finally, for the address, for geocoding purposes, it was quite important to separate the street number from the street address from the postcode region. Yeah. So speaking of geocoding, what we use was fuzzy string matching, which means we approximately try and match the addresses that we found from the telephone directories of 1881. So that was the trial run year that we were trying to develop a proof of concept for. And we try and match those to a georeference data set of addresses in 1881 from the census. Yeah, so speaking of postcode region just now, why it's relevant is that while the telephone directories mostly provide postcode regions of each address, the census provides users instead civil administrative boundaries. So this misalignment of the telephone exchange geography, the addresses there and the addresses in the census meant that for 1881, I had to try and use quite a primitive method where I looked for a really old, one of the first London postcode region maps, and tried to roughly guess what postcode regions each district could belong to, and then match addresses from there.
3 minutes.
Yeah. So finally, preliminary findings and future work. So as I mentioned, this project is still at an elementary stage, but from 1881, we can see patterns that we would expect where commercial subscribers tend to be much more focused in the central districts of London. Residential subscribers tend to be more spread out in the outer districts as well. And more broadly beyond this initial but not very telling analysis that I've done, potential analysis that we could use data for. So this advertisement is actually from the New York Telephone Company in 1918, and that was when the Spanish flu was happening. So it does show that history repeats itself, except now we have a lot more than the telephone to survive quarantine on. But yeah, so as you can see in the advertisement, the portrayal of the household that is able to subscribe to telephone, it's pretty wealthy. And especially when the telephone was just introduced, anyone who could subscribe was probably a well-to-do business or a wealthy family. So we could use the incremental addition to the telephone directories as a proxy indicator of how rich people were. And then bouncing on off this fact is also that we can use for the individuals, we can use their names to conduct a surname analysis. So looking at where there are wealth disparities in London, we can also see that through which surnames maybe were more represented in the earlier editions of the telephone directory. And finally, one of the weaknesses of census that can be partially, not fully rectified by using telephone directories is that census data is only collected every decade, but telephone directories are sometimes published multiple times a year. So it really helps to fill the gap, although not to a complete coverage of the population.
1 minute.
And finally, concluding thoughts, I feel that in a lot of the current work that's being done with GIS, people tend to look to the future, rightly so, for many different reasons, and also to the present. But GIS and a lot of the technology that we have today also enables us to do a lot of things in the past. And while we can do these broad stroke analysis in very quantitative geography, I think it could also be picked up on by, for instance, local historians who have a very specific focus. And finally, it's also about increasing public access to ancestry information. Someone might just want to know if they could trace their forefathers, where they lived, and maybe have a hint of what they did by the locations they were in. Yeah, and with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
I guess I'll start off with Nikki. What's going to happen to this data set once you're doing a lot of work? You've got a fantastic tool chain there that's going to make potentially extremely valuable bit of historical spatial data.
Yeah.
What's going to happen?
So I'd say as a start, it can integrate quite well with the other data sets, especially historical data sets that the CDRC has. Namely, if you go far back, then it's only the census. But in terms of time period, it also helps to fill a gap in that you have stuff that's much more recent, like electoral roll data, which starts maybe in the 1980s. And before that, you don't really have digitized data that covers a substantial portion of the population. Of course, the sample that you will get in the telephone directories are really biased until maybe the end of it, when almost every household is represented there. But I think a biased data set can also be interesting precisely because it's biased.
Mm-hmm. So at a more practical level, Nikki, is it going to be released as open data? Is it going into the CDRC? Will this be available to all the people sat in the audience right now that really want to have a go with it when you've finished?
Okay, so I'm not too clear, but it will go to the CDRC, and I think it will definitely go to BT because they're the providers. But I think most of the data sets in the CDRC will be available for, even if through some application process, to members of outside the CDRC, which are interested in potentially using the data. Yeah, so I guess you have to keep a lookout for when we expand the processing to the other years. Yeah.
Oh yeah, we definitely will. And Maurizio says it will be available. Lovely. And if there are no further questions from anyone else, I'm going to go for a third one, 3 in a row. So what's next for you? So you've got the kind of technical job here of doing this. Is that where it ends for you, or do you have an application in mind yourself for this research?
Yeah, so I think the application are on the slides that I mentioned. Oh yeah, I think I skipped over it actually. But so of course, a big chunk of the work is just the processing work. Mm-hmm. But then I think the dataset could help with questions, two questions that I'm particularly thinking about expanding on after this initial phase, which is to look at the change in geodemographic makeup of areas based on surname analysis, as well as, of course, accompanying this is internal migration. Because a lot of we do take surnames, especially in the UK, as quite indicative of geographical origins of one's ancestry. So of course now it's a lot more mixed, but if you can still look at a register of names and say, okay, that should be an Irish surname, or that was a name from the north of England a couple of tens of years ago. Yeah.
Absolutely. That's great. Thank you very much, Nikki. A fantastic presentation, very interesting. I'm sure we'll be looking out for that as it develops in the future and appears in journal articles and so on.